Well, welcome back. We are continuing the second unit of the three that we'll be studying this semester, and this is Chapter 16 in Unit 2, which focuses on the topic of mass media law, perhaps one of the, if not the, most important chapters and topics that we'll be studying this semester because it has such immediate relevance to the content of the mass media and the relationship of those people who communicate messages to us in the general public. You see 6 bullet points on the screen. We'll spend a bit of time examining each one of these points. Certainly, let me encourage you to study Chapter 16 of your textbook very carefully. I can only hit the high points here in this lecture, and as we move along, and as we have done in previous chapters, there will be page numbers that will refer you on these lecture topics to the pages in the textbook so that you can make certain that your understanding is at its greatest. So, 6 topics, let's get started. Let's talk about a little high school civics review to get us underway. You have studied the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and I have excerpted a really important portion here, not even taken it in its entirety, but that's okay because what we need to know is very much central to the first dash point that you see here. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the freedom of the press. Now, let's be reminded that that press is a very inclusive term. Whenever we use the term press, we could be talking about traditional print media, where the term originated in books, newspapers, and magazines. But as the mass media developed and radio and television came into being, journalists who reported over the 2 electronic media also became known as the press, as does anyone who reports today in new media that would involve distribution over the internet. So the press is a very broadly scoped term that describes journalists working in any media platform, new media or traditional media in print or electronic platforms. Now, second dash point here, our United States Constitution First Amendment protects almost all free expression from government interference. It's important to note that there are exceptions to this. When we were in our previous chapter, for example, I took us down a detailed discussion of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, created by Congress in 1934 to regulate the content of broadcast transmissions. Why? Because public broadcasters use publicly owned airwaves. And to ensure that public property is used properly, the FCC does have the authority and the power in certain instances to regulate the content of what radio and TV persons broadcast to us. At times when our president has declared war, there can be restrictions placed on the content of the mass media. And again, that third bullet point, which we talked about in detail in the previous chapter, that there is the possibility for ensuring that candidates who are running for federal elective office are treated fairly in the electronic media, fairly in the sense that broadcasters give equal amounts of airtime exposure to all of the candidates, not to favor the publicity of one candidate to the exclusion of others. That would not be fair. Prior restraint is discussed in this chapter, early in this chapter. Let's talk about that for just a moment. The phrase prior restraint, if we compare and contrast that with censorship, prior restraint describes an activity that takes place before something happens as opposed to censorship, which is something that can occur after something has happened. Now, what could that something be? Well, let's take an example. Let's say a TV broadcast. The United States Supreme Court has decided that there are times when a TV broadcaster might be prohibited from broadcasting information, restraining it prior to the broadcast under certain situations. And 3 of those are listed here in the bullet points. If it's deemed by the federal government that our national security has been threatened, then yes, our government can interfere, if you will, with a TV broadcast or with a newspaper story or a radio broadcast in order to protect the good of the people, to protect our national security. In instances where the content of the medium of the message is one that is likely to cause people to act unlawfully, the government has the right to step in and curtail that kind of speech. That is prior restraint. And certainly in times when the message might be one that could result in endangerment to the public, to threaten public safety, then our government has that opportunity available also. It is an exception to the right of free speech. Now, page 430 of your textbook, we begin a discussion about defamation, about defaming a person. What does it mean to defame someone, to take away their fame, to injure their reputation? I suspect that you are like most every other person, that you probably have worked hard to establish your reputation among your friends, within your family, your social group, your peers, and you certainly want to be protected. Let me change that word, not protected. You want to be protective of your reputation. You don't want someone spreading false information that would cause people to think less of you. So defamation, to take away, using the power of mass media messages, to take away someone's good name, when in fact that's not true. Well, that's libel. And there are legal remedies for that, including the 4 that you see on the screen. If you were to falsely assert using the mass media as the means of conveying your message, if you were to say over a radio or TV broadcast, or to print in a newspaper, for example, that someone is suffering from a mental illness or has a mental deficiency, if they've been accused of a crime, if they're a politician and they're incompetent in office, or if a person has associated with some type of hate group. 4 instances here. If you use the power of the mass media to make these kinds of accusations, and those accusations are false, then the person who you have identified as having one or more of these characteristics can take you to a court of law and sue you for libel. That's a 5-letter word, by the way. Please don't confuse that with a similar sounding 6-letter word that's spelled L-I-A-B-L-E. And the example of using that, you might say, I'm liable to be hungry later and I'll go get something to eat. That's L-I-A-B-L-E. Let's not confuse that with this 5-letter word, L-I-B-E-L. One of the most important aspects of libel law was decided in 1964 in a landmark Supreme Court case that involved a police commissioner serving in Montgomery, Alabama. And it involves an advertisement that was placed in what was at that time the leading and probably most important newspaper in the United States, the New York Times. And the police commissioner sued over the content of the information that was published on this page of the New York Times, because the information injured, or at least it was his assertion, that his reputation, his good name, had been injured. He was no longer thought of as highly by the public as a result of this article. So, second bullet point, we've talked about this abbreviation before. SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States, and the court asked this question: is the person in a court case involving libel, is the person who claims to have been libeled a public figure, or are they a private individual? Now, that's a two-way. You're either a public figure or you're a private individual, at least in the eyes of the court. Now, this is very subjective, and it would be decided on a case-by-case situation in a court of law where a libel charge had been made. Is the person a public figure? Is the person a private individual? Well, there's extensive discussion in the textbook, but let's look at it this way. The courts have said that a public figure, generally speaking, is a person who has, through some activity of their own, sought fame in the media, or has achieved a level of fame in the media. That's a pretty broad category. Let's talk about some examples here. Almost every politician, every person who runs for public office, is seeking publicity in the mass media. And yes, in every instance would be a public figure. But what other types of individuals receive press coverage? Well, certainly any celebrity, any movie star, any TV star. Athletes, both pro and amateur, seek publicity, and so probably would be considered in a libel case to be public figures. On the other hand, most of us have not achieved that same level of fame. And so I would suspect that unless you have won a major award, or let's say a beauty contest or something of that nature, then probably at this point in your life, in a libel case, you would be regarded as a private individual. So we've got some examples of public figures that we can think about, but also when we think about ourselves as private individuals, we draw a line of distinction here. Now the question is, why is this important? Why do the courts draw this line of distinction to determine whether or not the person who claims that they have been libeled is either a public figure or a private individual? It's important because the court determined that for a public official, a person who is known to the public, as we said on the previous screen, in order for them to sue for libel and to win that case in a court of law, they have what we call a really high burden of proof. They must prove in a court of law that the media organization, newspaper, radio station, TV station, whatever, must prove that that media organization, the people working in it, knew that that the information that they were publishing not only was false, not only did they know that what they were disseminating to the public was not true information, but they did it with reckless disregard. They tried to injure the reputation of the famous person. Now you stop and think for just a moment. How in a court of law, if you're that person, how do you go about proving what another person working in the media knew and what they were thinking in their mind? Bottom line is this: it's very difficult for a public figure to win a case of libel in a court because it is so difficult to prove that the person who made the false statement knew that it was false and also did so with the intention of damaging the reputation of the person who claims that they were libeled. Well, I'm sure this is a simplistic explanation for you. Let's suffice to say at this point of our study that this is a very complex situation, libel law. Those of you that are mass comm majors in the class, you'll study more about this in your senior year. Those of you who are taking this course but are not majors in mass communication, we'll leave it at this, and perhaps in some other course, maybe in a civics or history course, you'll come across this topic again, and you'll be a little better educated about it. Now, when it comes time in a court of law for a person to defend themselves against libel, let's quickly take a look at 3 defenses that one could offer against a charge of libel. And here's the really important one that we talked about going back to chapter 4, I believe it is, earlier in the semester. And that is, if you were in a court of law and you were alleging that someone in the mass media had damaged your reputation, had libeled you, all you would need to prove is that it was not the truth. If you can demonstrate that what is true, there can be no conviction of libel. This goes all the way back to the outcome of the trial with John Peter Zenger in colonial New York in 1735. If you need to go back to the previous chapter to refresh your memory of that, please do so. Bottom line is the 3rd bullet point. Truth is always its own defense. Now, we talked about public figures. Actual malice comes into the decision making at this point. That the journalist who published the information or broadcast the information about someone not only knew that it was false to begin with, but clearly, ignored that and decided to publish or broadcast it anyway with that intention of damaging the reputation of the person. Well, then there is no defense against that. But as I said earlier, a charge of actual malice is pretty difficult to prove in a court of law. And the fact is, and I'll talk about this again later in just a moment, we don't see that many libel cases involving public figures in the news. Do you recognize the lady pictured here? This is a screen capture from a sketch on her network TV series back in the 1970s, 40 years ago. This lady's name, she is the actress Carol Burnett. And this sketch that she's depicted in comes from her TV program. The sketch is titled, it's an ongoing sketch called Mama's Family. Carol Burnett was in the 1970s. If you need her equivalent today, think of someone like perhaps Tina Fey or Amy Poehler or perhaps Amy Schumer, young comedians who are extremely talented and extremely popular with the public. Well, that's who Carol Burnett was in the 1970s. Her television program ran for 11 seasons on the CBS TV network, and it was watched by millions of people. And she was, and still is, a very much beloved actress. Well, why are we talking about this now? In the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, the National Enquirer, the tabloid newspaper that you see on the checkout stands at the grocery store, printed an article about Carol Burnett, alleging that she was in a restaurant in Washington, D.C., that she was intoxicated, that she was loud and boisterous, causing a commotion. Well, that article went to press. The fact of the matter is Carol Burnett sued the National Enquirer for libel because she was a teetotaler. She did not drink and therefore would not be publicly intoxicated. Witnesses at the restaurant upheld her contention that she was there, but she was not acting boisterously. or causing any type of commotion or scene in the restaurant. Bottom line was, she successfully proved in a court of law that the statements made about her that were published in the National Enquirer were not true and had been put there solely to damage her reputation, to make her admiring public think less of her. And the courts agreed with that, and if memory serves me correctly, the award for damages was something in the range of $8 million. Now, we know what the value of $8 million is in today's money. Think back what $8 million was worth 40-something years ago. Okay, let's move into a different area of law, one that is extremely important to all of us because we are involved in the use of information. And we need to understand that our United States government protects the people, any person, who creatively expresses information. United States copyright law, the exclusive right to reproduce original works. Okay, what in the world does that mean? We are all creative persons, aren't we? Some of us may be more creative than the others. I suspect that I fall pretty low on the creativity scale. But think about all the ways that human beings are able to express their creative talents. People can write books. They can compose music. They can write the lyrics to a song. They can write the musical melody to a song. People can create TV programs. People can take photographs. People can design computer software. People can make recordings of performances. Some people sculpt statues. Some people are involved in architectural drawings. I can't be totally inclusive, but I think you get the idea here. There are a lot of different ways that we can express our creativity. And United States copyright law exists to protect our expressions. For example, if we were to compose a song, would we want some other person recording our composition and selling that and profiting from it without us profiting? And so the law is there to protect that expression of creativity. That song can be registered in the United States Copyright Office, which is located within the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and it gives the creator certain legal protections. If you compose the song, you can copyright it, and no one else can perform your song or use it in any way without you giving your permission to do so. And if you want to make a charge for its use, you certainly are entitled to do so. We could compare and contrast copyright law with patent law right quickly. Patent laws are authorized by the United States government to protect things, inventions of things. The phonograph record player is a patented item, as is Edison's light bulb. Copyright extends to the expression of creativity, not to tangible objects, but to intangible things, such as the 7 or so different examples that I gave you on the previous screen. So if we compare copyright and patent laws, both do provide legal protection of original ideas. But as you see in the third bullet point, physical objects, tangible objects are eligible for patents, whereas expressions of creativity are eligible for copyright protection. The mass media collectively are full of people's expressions of creativity, so this is a very important subject to address in this chapter. I've talked about the purpose already, but look at the second bullet point. If you were to write a song and if you were to register that song with the Copyright Office in Washington, that protection, that legal protection, is yours for the rest of your life, plus 70 years beyond that for persons who succeed you. If you have children or grandchildren, they are entitled to the legal protection of your expression 70 years after you have departed the face of this earth. So that's a long, long, long time. We're going to watch a video in class about copyright law. Let me clue you in to one little piece about that video that is presented, but is no longer true. The video was produced several years ago, and since the time that that video was produced, there's been a major decision about the copyright of a song that we all know and have probably sung many times in our lives. You may not be aware, but until about 3 years ago, Warner Brothers Music claimed that it held the copyright to the song Happy Birthday to You. And so every time that song was sung in what's called legally a public performance, then Warner Brothers had a right of entitlement to be paid for its use. Now, please don't misunderstand. Singing this in someone's home at a birthday party is not legally considered to be a public performance. So there's no infringement on copyright law in those instances. Bottom line is, after something like 60 years, the court decided that Warner Brothers did not hold the copyright to that song, and so we now say that Happy Birthday to You is a song that exists in the public domain. It is not copyrighted. It can be used at any time by any person in any type of performance without any problem in infringing on copyright. Many times we talk about how music is used in the mass media, and certainly whether we're talking about music by a radio broadcast or distributed over the internet, such as Pandora or Spotify, or maybe within perhaps a podcast, or over a television broadcast or in a movie. There's a number of different ways in which music is conveyed via the mass media. And there are any number of instances, any number of situations that need to be taken into consideration when we talk about the use of copyrighted music. For our purposes, because this is something that, thanks to the internet about 16 or 17 years ago, became a matter of concern for almost every American, and in fact for people around the world. The United States is not the only civilized nation in the world that recognizes this idea of copyright. It is recognized in probably over 200 nations around the world, and each government has a means of administering copyright law. But in the United States, let's focus on this issue of the downloading of music files over the internet. And you may or may not, as you have grown up and as you have become an internet user, you may have been exposed to this, and you may already know something about this issue. But the fact is, in the early 2000s, it was determined that the sharing of songs, from CDs that we have ripped, people rip and store on their computers, the sharing of these recorded files over the internet violated the rights of the recorded music copyright holders. And so it became a really almost untenable situation in the recorded music industry, because the ease and the inexpensiveness of sharing music files across the internet clearly removed any need for a person to go to, now get this, here's an old term for you, to go to a record store, to go to a retail bricks and mortar kind of store to purchase a CD, when it could easily be downloaded for free over the internet. The only problem is doing so violated the copyrights of the record labels who owned those recordings. And every time someone downloaded a song for free, that meant that there was another file that the record label was not making any money on, depriving them of the right to earn their living. So all of this came to a head, and here we are now 10, 12 years later. There are still instances in which song files, and movies for that matter, and TV shows, are being illegally downloaded over the internet. Now we're talking all of these types of files are copyrighted materials, and unless they are purchased through an authorized agent, let's take iTunes for example, and let's say you buy a song from iTunes. No concern about illegal downloading there. You're making a legitimate business transaction when you buy from iTunes. But if you're out on one of the torrent sites and you're downloading this music and not paying the copyright holder, you're breaking the law. Let's just tell it like it is. Plain and simply, you're breaking the law. You are illegally downloading something without having the legal authority to do so. Now, federal law protects against those occurrences by giving some protection to those people who own those copyrights to recorded music and TV shows and movies. We'll focus on music since that is probably the predominant type of file loading issues that occur. And we talk about two forms of copyright protection. We talk about the Circle C and the Circle P. The Circle C protects the creative interest of those people who write the words to the song, and it protects the interest of those who compose and create the musical notes for the song. But there's also a form of copyright protection called Circle P. And Circle P is served to indicate that a record label, such as Sony or RCA, has made a recording of the performance of the song, and because some creativity is involved in making that recording, then the recording studio or the record label can also claim a copyright, and they indicate that they own that copyright by using the Circle P symbol on the CD jewel case or in other places where the public notice would have to be made. The RIAA, look at the 4 bullet points here. The Recording Industry Association of America represents all of the major recording studios, the major labels, if you will, and it is the recording labels, the studios, who have suffered the loss of millions and millions of dollars due to illegal file sharing across the internet. And maybe they came a little late to the scene in trying to press this matter in the courts and make claims of copyright infringement. But when they did, they became very aggressive. Let's say maybe about 10 years ago, when they could identify a person and prove in a court of law that that person was illegally sharing copyrighted recorded music files across the internet without having the legal permission to do so, then the RIAA would take this person to court and sue them. And let's just be very simple and very blunt and very plain about copyright law. The fact is, the studios had complete protection in this instance. In other words, if you illegally share a copyrighted, let me take that back. Let me not talk about you. Let's say if a person illegally shares a recorded music file that they don't own, then the RIAA can file a lawsuit against that individual, take them to court, sue them, and here's the important point. The RIAA will win every time. Copyright law is that specific, and all they have to do is to demonstrate that the act occurred. If you want to know a little bit more about how painful that can be, let me talk with you and wrap up our discussion by telling you about a lady in Minneapolis named Jamie Thomas. She had something like 22 recorded songs on her computer that she was sharing with other people over one of the popular file sharing sites. Back at that time, the sites were known as Napster and Grokster and Audio Galaxy, and I don't know, there were several others. She was doing this maybe about 10 years ago, and the RIAA found out. They identified her internet address and determined that she was the one doing this, and they took her to court and they sued her, and the court determined that she owed the RIAA and its recording studio members a total of $222,000. She is still working to this day to try and figure out how to make payment on that fine. So, a word to the wise may be sufficient here. Just understand that copyright law exists to protect the legal and financial interest of persons who have creative expressions. In this instance, it's the recorded music industry, who has talented people who can arrange studios and so forth to make expert recordings of performances of music. And in this instance, the RIAA decided to make Jamie Thomas a poster child for bad behavior, and you certainly would not want that to happen to you. We'll wrap up today, and I'll leave this screen available to you so that if you want to read more about this situation. But just keep in mind that there are ways of monitoring a person's activities on the internet, and for those people that think they might be getting away with something that is determined illegal, well, perhaps not. Hey, thanks for your attention. We're going to continue this discussion in the classroom, but please, if you haven't read chapter 16 very carefully, please do so. And I'll see you next time when we get to our final chapter of the textbook. It's not the last one that we will study this semester, but it is the final chapter in the textbook, and that's 17.